My name is Bennett Rogers. I used to be Ann Collier Bennett. I was born in California and came to Oregon when I was 17 in 1969. My first fair was in 1973, and it was a completely different kind of place. It wasn't near as crowded, and there was main stage, and there was a lot. I knew a lot of the people who had booths, and it was really neat because it was like all my friends were in one spot, and if they weren't my friends, they were at least like thinking, and so it was really kind of neat, and really to be someplace where you felt really comfortable with people who you all shared the same opinion. And part of the thing was, I really feel things were very political in that day. Maybe it was just my youth, but you know, Vietnam was going on. I had lived part of my life in Latin America. The situations there with military juntas and things like that had had a deep effect upon my personal life, and many people didn't understand that. But the people here understood that, and so it was a very comfortable place to be. And so that was a lot of it. I left Oregon and I lived in Europe for a couple years, and when I came back, I came to the fair, and I ended up in 6 years in Arizona working as an archaeologist, which made me a better archaeologist. And so I came back to the fair. When I was in Arizona, I'd come up and visit my family, and I would try and make it during fair so I could see people and that I knew, and hang out with my nuclear family as well as my bigger family. And when I returned to Oregon in 1984, I started becoming more involved in fair, and I really became involved in 1986 when I started training John Stamp in archaeology, and he said, "You want to do an exhibit for the fair?" And so in the summer of 1987, I did the very first exhibit on archaeology for the country fair, and I've been involved in that ever since then. And so it's given me an opportunity to work with a great data set. There's a lot of information here. I know a lot about the archaeology of the country fair. When I graduated from college, I was told by my archaeology professor that if I wanted to, I could do the archaeology of the Willamette Valley, and that's 1973. So here we are in 2015, and the archaeology of the Willamette Valley, there's still nobody doing it except for the fair, and I probably know more about it, and especially along the Long Tom drainage from the foot of the Coast Range all the way to the Willamette River than most people today. And part of it is because of my involvement here in the archaeology and exploring and being able to look at all the work that was done as part of the highway and everything else. So, you know, it became an activity that I did, you know, to see my friends, to also being interwoven into my professional life in many ways. So the archaeological sites, there's 16 that have been identified on the OCF property, and 11 of those have been formally recorded, and what that means is that the State Historic Preservation Office has records of all these sites, and they've all been determined eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. And the National Register of Historic Places is codified in our National Historic Preservation Act, and what it does is it allows people to identify the most important archaeological sites and include them in a register. None of these sites have been nominated, which is a whole nother step, but eligibility, being determined eligible, gives them that status in terms of protection. And part of the reason that has been really important to the Oregon Country Fair is the Veneta-Notai Highway, and how there were 2 sites there identified, and so they were going to condemn the property under eminent domain and take the highway through the country fair and then get rid of all their problems. And but the fair had archaeological sites on it too. And so when that happened, it was identified that, you can't condemn or use eminent domain because for the same resource concern that they had in their right-of-way. And so that shoved ODOT back into their right-of-way and actually preserved the archaeological sites that are on the fair property, because there was no mitigation or data recovery to mitigate for construction of the highway. And so it becomes something that now we have to protect because it's been identified in that manner. And we have some of the most significant sites, because of the work the fair did, some of the most significant sites in the state of Oregon and in Western Oregon. We have a date of 10,800 years at the Stamp site, which is located on fair property, where the lagoons are, and that's the oldest site, and we have many other sites, and so it covers a time period of over 10,000 years, and or almost of 10,000 years, and so it's kind of neat in some ways, and it can be a burden in other ways, and but you do. One of the interesting things is under Oregon state law, the federally recognized tribes are co-stewards. So anything we do to impact a site here, we really have to, we end up having to address through tribal relations with the descendants of the Kalapuya who are on the Grand Ronde and Siletz reservations primarily. And so any type of mitigation we would ever want to do, they would have to be our partners and in those decisions, which is really kind of neat, and as it should be. So, we have a lot of history because this area was along the Oregon Trail, and early homesteaders coming through here. Many of the names in Oregon are based on people who originally settled in this West Lane County area. So it's been a heavily used area for that 10,000 years. There's 90 to 95% of the population died due to epidemics in the early 1800s. So when the settlers come in, it's kind of open ground. You can kind of get an idea as to growth exponentially. Going back to that 1973 fair and 2015, this is pretty amazing. There's a lot of people here. So, I like it on Upper River Loop. It's still relatively quiet, and it's a long way from everything, and sometimes I could pretend that it's way back then, because way back then the fair reminded me of of small villages in Morocco that I visited in the in 74, 75 at night, and that's another thing I like too. Reminded me of Morocco. Which is really funny because when my mom moved to Eugene after my dad died, Eugene reminded her of Montevideo, where she had lived. So.